episode 10 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is Steve Holland. Steve spent a decade climbing the ranks of the Liberal Party before becoming the youngest ever mayor of Victoria's Mornington Peninsula. It was as mayor that he quickly discovered that, rather than the elected councillors running the bureaucracy, it was the bureaucracy that ran the councillors. He explains more in the interview, but the story he related to me off camera changed my perspective, to a degree, about the nature of the problem of government in Australia, at all levels. I considered some of my own negative experiences with government bureaucrats, such as the one who bragged, "We crush many a dream around this place," or the one who told me my building could not be used because the sprinkler system might spray too much water to put a fire out, or the one who said it was discriminatory to not teach barbell squats to people in wheelchairs, or the one who demanded I rebuild the entire front facade of a new high-performance sports facility because two people in wheelchairs needed to be able to pass each other in the entry with dignity. Most people who have tried to do anything from building a house to starting a business in Australia can share similarly infuriating stories of government absurdities like these and much, much worse. It turns out Steve experienced the same frustrations as mayor. The endless government aggravations that touch our lives every day are not typically the big policy issues that shape our voting decisions. They are the whims and machinations of the permanent, unelected bureaucracy, far removed from headline election policies. Could this be the real problem? Is it the machinery of government that is robbing us of our freedom, money, and happiness more than the person we elect to steer it? Could it be that the reason it makes no difference whether Labor or Liberals are in power is not just because they are a uni party, but because the machinery of government is not in their control? They are controlled by the machine. If so, what do we do? Or what can we task an elected official to do to fix a demon machine that will go to any lengths necessary to maintain its power? Steve graciously shared his ideas with me about this and much, much more. Mr. Steve Holland, thank you very much for coming on the Liberty Itch podcast. Welcome.
My pleasure.
You became mayor. You get into the job. What did you discover about how things really worked in the council?
People will be, quite familiar with other levels of government, federal and state, namely, but perhaps not with the way that local government is structured, which is very different. So the elected representatives at a council level, they don't have sort of executive power. They don't have decision-making authority in and of their own position. You've got an elected council, let's say you've maybe got 10 or 11 or however many. They make decisions in the council chamber. They don't make decisions themselves. They don't have the ability to go out and instruct a staff member. They don't, outside of the council chamber and the council majority, it might be 6 out of 10, or in my case, it was 6 out of 11. That's where the decision-making power resides. And so people that have studied politics at a undergraduate level are probably familiar with terms like the authorising environment and legitimacy. Most people would assume that politicians, especially in a elected representative democracy, assume that politicians get their legitimacy from the people that elect them, which is the case in democracy. The power resides with the people.
That's what it's supposed to mean, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. And they hand it over, once every 3 years or 4 years, however often there's an election. And that's certainly the case at a council level too, which is supposed to be representative. But because individual councillors don't have any executive authority, they're not ministers like you'd find at a state or federal level, they have to make decisions as a group. And so an individual councillor, if you go to your local councillor, whoever you elected or whoever was elected, and you ask them to do something, they're not going to be able to have the power to go out and start directing the garbage truck collector or the person mowing the lawns or whatever. They don't have the ability to do that. In fact, in most states, including Victoria, where I'm from, it's actually against the law for a councillor to direct a staff member. They're more like a board of directors. And so going back to what I originally said, where do they get their legitimacy? Yes, the people that elected them, who they represent, but they also get their legitimacy from the bureaucracy, which councillors need to rely on the bureaucracy in order to deliver the individual things they might want to achieve or that they're promised. And that makes the role very different.
So even if all of the councillors agree on a particular direction to go with a particular issue, they can only suggest that to the bureaucracy without any real weight behind it, or they can direct it and order the bureaucracy to take out those actions?
Well, that's a very good question, and
I
there
would
is
have thought it's
debate
a
about
simple
that.
yes or no.
In practice, it might work very different to the way that it should work, where
Yeah.
councillors in a council chamber, a majority of them might make a decision, for example. And then it's often debated about whether it is within council's remit to be able to make a decision about that. For example, about operational matters. There's often debates in many states, depending on the local government act in your particular state, what are the powers of council? And often in one section, it will define the powers of the chief executive officer, which is like a super bureaucrat. And they largely exercise operational power. So they have the ability to hire and fire, for example. The council
And the councillors don't.
council cannot hire and fire anyone except the CEO. It's certainly the case in Victoria and all the states in Australia. So let's say, for example, a majority of councillors wanted some low-level employee to be fired. They wouldn't be able to do that even if they passed a motion to that effect, because it's not the power resides in the chief executive officer and not in
So
the
even the
council.
mayor, the elected mayor, the person that the people voted in to represent their wishes over council, can't just fire a person doing a terrible job or the wrong thing completely against the public interest and what the public voted for.
Certainly not. And it differs
That's
from
tragic.
state to state what the Local Government Act in the relevant state says. But this is a big issue, and it's an issue that not a lot of people quite understand about the way local government is structured. There'll be people that will be watching this saying, well, local government is unconstitutional, it shouldn't even be a level of government, and that's actually not correct.
Not correct, no.
Local government is instituted by states and territories via an act of parliament. So in
Yes.
Victoria, just because I'm familiar with that, the Local Government Act is a piece of legislation that's passed by the Victorian Parliament, by the state government. And just because local government is not recognised in the Constitution doesn't make them unconstitutional. As we know, anything that's not expressly laid out in the Commonwealth or federal constitution is what's called a residual power. And that means it's up to the states to decide what goes on there. And that's why state governments are so powerful. And one of the things state governments have decided to do is to create this third tier, which they have called local government. And they're effectively body corporates. In fact, if you read the opening preamble on the legislation in your relevant state, it will say that they are instituted as body corporates and they operate within the confines of the Local Government Act.
Yep. Okay. But still, that brings us back to the fact that the councillors that we're electing, it's a farce. We're told that we have democracy and we're actually voting on the issues that matter to us, but actually the power doesn't reside within those people who are elected.
Over a long period of time, that has certainly been watered down, and a lot of people that are older than I am, I'm 32, people would remember the days where local government councillors had much more authority to do things that they don't now. And so over successive years, state governments have watered down the powers of individual councillors to the point now where really the only power you have as an individual councillor is your one vote in the council chamber. So you're relying on a majority of your colleagues, and even then the powers of the council as a whole are restricted. And that
really
has allowed a growing bureaucracy. And so we see this, we do see this at state and federal level, but I think local government is such a perfect example of it because of the limited powers of elected representatives. We expect our elected representatives to be more powerful than bureaucrats. And so if we talk about federal and state politics, you don't expect a bureaucrat to be able to override a minister, for example. A minister is supposed to have executive decision-making authority within their respective portfolio.
Correct.
But it's increasingly the case now that bureaucrats have been in their positions for a significantly longer period of time than the politician has. And what we know in politics, government more broadly, the longer a person is in a position, the more powerful they become. Simply by virtue of who they know, what they know how it operates.
That's right, the fiefdom that they build around themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you've got a situation now in Australia And I know John Ruddick has talked about this, where bureaucrats are amassing more power than the elected representatives. And it becomes a very difficult thing then when new politicians get elected to turn that ship around. I think we're seeing that in the United States. I think Donald
Correct.
Trump probably worked that out in his first term as president, how
Very
difficult it
much so.
was. And
Yeah.
so you often have the situation where councillors can be fighting with the bureaucracy at a local government level. And I think that probably happens more often at local government level than it does at state and federal, simply because of the structure of that level of government.
Yeah, but it's still analogous to what happens the further up the chain that you go. And
Absolutely.
you were saying when we spoke that essentially it's not so much that you're ignored by the bureaucracy, but they're recalcitrant. They essentially give the orders because they know they're in a position of power over you, though ostensibly it's supposed to be the other way around. So can you
Well,
give an
well,
example of
yeah. I mean, and it is correct to say recalcitrant, because if there's something that the bureaucracy doesn't particularly like, even if there's majority support on the council, you'll get enormous pushback on that. Uh,
and effective pushback too, not just
Absolutely, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, the bureaucracy is the one implementing the decisions of the council. And what happens when a bureaucracy flatly refuses to implement a decision, or they do a bad job of it
well, I think we
deliberately? We
saw
would
that
hope
with
not.
Tony Abbott. I think that was when Tony Abbott got in, and it was probably the most egregious, publicly visible. No, we're not going to do what what you tell us to
Well,
do.
and look, and there's certainly an element of capital P politics there, because I think the Labor
Mm,
Party in Australia is very good at making appointments that, on the face of it, don't seem political, but certainly are, when the
yeah,
bureaucracy is not supposed to be political at all. And what tends to happen is, when the Liberal governments eventually get re-elected,
they
sends
can't get
the
anything
Labor
done.
governments to the opposition. The Liberal government does not take a broom through the bureaucracy, and they simply allow those people to stay where they are, and the size of government and the bureaucracy itself continues to grow. Really, a new government should take a clean sweep to department heads, to various political appointed positions, and they should install people that support the agenda that got them elected, because at the end of the day, it's a democracy and it's majority rule.
What Trump's doing is what's needed.
And as I said, I think
We
he
need a
learned,
Doge.
yeah, he learned his lessons in the first term there.
Well and
And,
truly.
and if I can relate it to my own experiences, as somebody that probably didn't think they were ever going to hold public office, that really wasn't what I was interested in politically. It was a very steep learning curve. And so you asked for an example. I mean,
Yeah, I was going to say, can you give an example of yeah?
yeah, look, in terms of policy decisions, I mean, I had some um, quite shocking wins, actually. I can't point to a majority decision that wasn't implemented in my time in council. I think we had a very good bureaucracy that, when a council decision, as messy as it was, as difficult it was in the lead up to the process, the chief executive officer, would respond to the decisions of council.
Hmm.
So I can't point to an example where, a bureaucracy has refused to implement a decision, because if that were to happen in a council, and it does happen, what tends to happen after that is the council then resolves to end the contract of the chief executive officer. And so it's in
Hmm.
the interests of the chief executive officer, which is the one staff member councillors can hire and fire, to actually
Right.
implement those decisions. There were
But
some,
it's a very long-winded, a roundabout way of getting
exactly.
things done if you need to get them done, though.
Yeah, from a point of decision, it can be quite a long road to actually getting that decision implemented. I did have some wins. One policy I remember was, it was just about planting trees, basically, which is something most people expect their local council to do. In my particular area, there's been a lot of tree loss, not because of development or anything like that. It's actually been primarily disease in my neck of the woods, and a lot of people
Okay.
live here because of the trees. That's what it is. Where the
Yeah,
bush
it's
meets the
beautiful.
ocean. That's what the Mornington Peninsula
Yeah.
is known for. And one of the things I wanted to do very early in my term, and something I campaigned on, was having what's called a urban forest strategy, or a tree canopy strategy, which is just about maintaining the tree canopy you've got in public areas and in private areas, and hopefully expanding that. Shade is a good thing. It's about amenity, and some people will say it's about climate change and whatever. It wasn't that for me, but anybody that wanted to be on board, I was happy with that. It's something that I prosecuted at the start of the term, and it took almost 4 years to get to that point.
To
And you get
plant trees.
opposition in terms of, oh, we don't have enough resources at the moment, we don't have the budget at the moment. Oh, the team that would be responsible for that policy is working on something else at the moment, and so it's a workload issue. Uh, and you just have to
We're
be
talking
persistent.
planting trees, which
Yeah, that's right.
presumably you've got people hired in facilities for planting trees as a normal
Yes,
course
as
of
every council
council.
would. Exactly.
Right.
And it
Yeah.
took 4
But it
years
still
to
took
get
four
that
years.
policy change implemented. It's fantastic now that it is, but that's one example of the fight that it takes your local councillor to be able to change policy and make a meaningful impact. There were other wins that I had that certainly the bureaucracy was not happy with, and some of them I was a bit surprised about. One of them, I mean, every year the council does the budget process, and one year I came across a line item which was about the council's carbon neutral status. Every year they tried to say that they were carbon neutral and slap the logo on all of the documents and whatever that we're a carbon neutral shire. And I realised the way they were achieving this was by using ratepayers' money to purchase carbon credits, and some of those carbon credits were for offshore projects. Now, anybody with any sense would say that this is not something that a local council should be spending ratepayers' money on, and certainly not for
No.
overseas projects. I mean, what are we doing? I think off the top of my head, I might be remembering incorrectly. I think there were two projects I remember. One was about clean water, and one was about planting trees. And it was in like China and India or something. I'm thinking,
Oh, for
what
God's
what
sake.
what
Yeah.
about clean water and planting trees? In our neck of the
Yeah.
woods, like next door
You
to me,
can't get
that'd be
you
nice.
take 4 years to get some trees
Exactly.
planted in
I
your
think it was
actual shire,
it was
and they're
only two
paying for
hundred
them in
thousand
China.
dollars as well. So in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking about millions of dollars, but $200,000 is still a lot of money that you can put towards
To a
something else.
council, and a small council too.
Well,
That's
it Mornington Peninsula Shire is a pretty decent sized council. The budget's
what's a
around
yeah,
$300 million
sizable.
a year, but
Okay.
still $200,000 on international carbon credits, that wasn't going to fly. So I wrote up the motion, and I did it. I did it the wrong way. That bureaucrats will say it's the wrong way. Effectively, there was a policy which was the carbon neutral policy that outlined all of the goals and the targets, and then that required the policy to be funded through the budget process. Now, the correct way a bureaucrat will say is, okay, well, you need to update the policy. So you need to move a motion to change the policy. It will go through the process. Let's say you might add a new clause saying, okay, no international carbon credits. That's a new clause in the policy. I did it through the budget process. I just deleted the line item from the budget, which meant that there was a policy, there was a program, but there was no longer a corresponding $200,000 budget to fund it. And I didn't think
Seems
it would.
reasonable.
I didn't think it would get up, right? And I did this quite often on a number of issues, and some of them were controversial. And I copped a lot of heat for it, and a lot of made my colleagues very unhappy sometimes, which maybe is not politically the right move if you need to horse trade on something. But I put up this amendment to the budget, and to my surprise, 6 out of 11 councillors supported it. And
So it
so,
went through.
before you know it, I had the CEO talking to me about, well, we still have the policy to achieve carbon neutral status, but now you've just deleted the budget for it, and how are we going to fix this? And I said, well, I wasn't expecting the council to support that move, but they did. And actually, it came back to council, and they reaffirmed the decision that they made. So it ultimately had to be implemented. We just did the messy work of updating the policy afterwards, after the line item was actually deleted. But it requires persistence, and if you're not prepared to put up a motion or an amendment as a local councillor, then you're not going to get those wins, and sometimes they might be a bit of a surprise to you.
You seem like a too much of a practical, intelligent person to be in politics. Why did you do it to yourself? Is it a form of self-harm or something else?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I mean, I was involved in politics from quite a young age, younger than most people. I joined the Liberal Party at 17. I didn't join the Young Liberals either. I just joined the rank and file, the main Liberal Party, with my local branch. I was 17. The average age was probably 60 or 70 years old. So it plummeted when I joined my local branch.
Why? What motivated you
I
to
was
do
just
that?
interested in politics.
Okay.
Learning about it in school, high school, just interested me. I thought about my values. I thought, okay, well, I quite like the idea of lower taxes and smaller government. Small business is always where I had my own personal career passion. And I thought, well, okay, well, that's the Liberal Party. In hindsight, yes, I'm centre-right. I was always a Libertarian, but I joined the Liberal Party. And because I joined the party proper as opposed to Young Liberals, which is where a lot of younger people cut their teeth when they're at university, they join Young Labor or the Greens or Socialist Alternative most of the time, or
socialists,
whatever they want to at university, and that's where they cut their teeth. But I just did it as a rank and file member, so I learnt the actual inner workings of a major political party very early. And my background is as a web developer, and I've been doing that since I was very young too, making websites. And so I combined my digital skills with my political skills, and that was actually my interest, was actually on the ground campaigning, campaign messaging, all of that sort of thing. And so
you didn't just join, you actually got actively involved straight away.
Yeah. I very quickly became an office bearer of my local branch. In the end, I'd worked myself up to quite a senior position in the Liberal Party. I was the chairman of my electorate conference. So there's federal electorates. Everybody knows, which one they belong to when they come to vote in a federal election. I was the president of the federal electorate for the Liberal Party in my area. I served on state council, which is a large membership body, state assembly, which is a more senior membership body, and then was elected to the steering committee of state assembly as well. And this is the committee that deals with controversial issues.
How old were you at this point?
When I eventually got on the steering committee, I think I was probably 26 or 7, I think.
Okay, so yeah, you've been at this for years at this point.
Yeah, at that point, a long time, 10 years.
Yeah.
And it really opened up my eyes to the way government works and the way politics works in particular, and especially being a Liberal Party in the state of Victoria, where the Liberal Party is an absolute basket case. I mean, they can't run a bath, let alone an election campaign, and we're all the worse for it because we're getting successive Labor governments, and it goes back to what we just mentioned before. It's the same with political parties. The longer they're in power, the more power they amass.
Yes.
And the more complacent that they get as well. And then there's
and they've just been stacking the bench against
exactly.
any reasonableness.
So when the Liberal Party does eventually come back to power, if it ever does in Victoria, it just which is probably a live question at this point, there'd be a massive bureaucratic inertia. Yeah. And that's a big problem at a state government level, because you're not just talking about a bureaucracy, you're also talking about, for state governments, a judiciary too. If you've got, and crime is a big issue in Victoria, you appoint judges, for example, sometimes for 10 years or more, depending on how old they are. I think the compulsory retirement age in Victoria is still 70 for judges, but that creates a massive inertia. And so the bureaucracy, judiciary, all of these different roles, non-government, including and police and emergency services, it's a massive problem. So me joining the Liberal Party was basically my interest in politics. I didn't think I'd run, and then what happened, just before COVID, I had 3 councillors in my area that were all retiring. I was kind of talking to my Liberal Party friends about it, and he said, well, 3 of them are retiring. That leaves 3 spots available here. Somebody should be putting up their hand. We need good people. But basically everybody, including myself, eventually settled on, well, it's going to be you. And so I ran. The pandemic hit, right? And I decided to run. This before the pandemic got serious. This was in December 2019. The pandemic really came around in, say, February. Yeah. And we'd been hearing about it in other countries in January, February. People started, like I was in Sydney at one point, there were people wearing masks, and I thought, what the hell is this? And then the pandemic hit properly. The lockdown started thanks to a federal Liberal government, which was not true to its principles, and a state Labor government, which just wanted to keep everybody at home.
Which was true to its principles.
Yeah, exactly. And I decided, well, actually, now I think it's even more important to run. And so it kind of solidified my decision. And then that election was in the October, November that year. And what ended up happening, I rumped it in. It's a multi-member ward at the time. 3 candidates got elected. I think there were 14 candidates in total. With a multi-member ward, you need 25% plus 1 in order to get elected. I got a 23% primary. The next candidate got a 10% primary, just for example. Okay. And so I basically got in with barely any preferences required.
Well, I'm guessing basically everybody in Mornington knew you at this point because you'd been visible.
Not particularly. No. I mean, it helped, obviously, that it's a Liberal area, but in Victoria, the Liberal Party doesn't help local government councillors run for election and doesn't endorse them. So it wasn't like I was running as a Liberal councillor.
You were running.
I wasn't allowed to use their logo. They don't give you any money, things like that. You're on your own. You are an independent. But I did openly declare that I was a member of the Liberal Party, which in a Liberal area you would expect does help you. But this whole time also, whilst I was a Liberal member, I was a Libertarian. And, I've had lots of clashes with the Liberal Party, including members of Parliament over the years. Some of them I'm fortunate enough to still call friends. Others definitely never have been and never will be friends because of some of the things I might have said about them or to them, mostly to them. Eventually I just decided that the Liberal Party wasn't where it was at. And COVID, I would say, was the straw that broke the camel's back.
The real clincher, yeah. Yeah, well, they didn't disagree at all with anything that the Labor government did at that point in time. No. They tried criticising them, and then when they were asked, well, what would you do differently? They said nothing at all. It was absolutely embarrassing.
Oh, exactly. And the vaccine mandates as well. I mean, I say this as somebody that has no issue with vaccines and was vaccinated myself. It flies in the face of all of their core principles to require that and to not do anything about the states requiring it either. But not just that, but the Liberal Party in Victoria
flies in the face of all medical principles too. Let's not forget that.
The Liberal Party in Victoria, but added insult to injury there by actually requiring their members of Parliament and their candidates to get vaccinated as well in order to participate in party affairs. I was required by my municipality to get vaccinated if I wanted to walk into the chamber, for example. Nothing was done by the Liberal Party about these issues. And I think in hindsight, a lot of them regret it. But for me, it was just, as I said, it was a straw that broke the camel's back. And Scott Morrison as Prime Minister did a terrible job. I mean, he undermined many tenets of democracy too by secretly swearing himself into multiple portfolios, which again, I think is completely appalling and goes to, the core principles he holds to the extent that he holds any. The Liberal Party increasingly, in my eyes, is not liberal, let alone libertarian, which is a separate ideology altogether.
Yeah, well, a lot of obviously more libertarian-minded people that I've spoken to who entered the Liberal Party in the last 10, 20 years have said the same thing. It's they go in and it's almost an immediate clamping down by the rest of the membership into the one party ideology and going along with whatever the party says, regardless of principle or your own personal beliefs. Is that what you found as well? Is that
totally? They don't like it if you speak out, and certainly not to the media. Which again, to fast forward, I mean, from high school, I then went to university and to become a journalist. Actually, I did broadcast media, television, radio, and my major was politics and economics. That's where I thought I'd go. In the end, I picked politics over journalism. Yeah. But, the media in Australia will often give you a surface level of what the political parties are and how they operate. I kind of used my media skills to my advantage when I wanted to make an internal change. And you mentioned earlier about the cash ban. That was one of the early things where, I mean, again, it was the Liberal government at a federal level was implementing a ban on cash transactions. What the hell is the Liberal Party doing, even considering that, let alone progressing the policy to the point where it passed the lower house and eventually was referred by the Senate to a Senate committee, which is actually why I mentioned before I was in Sydney in the February before the pandemic. That's why I was in Sydney. I was at a cash ban hearing for the Senate inquiry into the policy. But what I did was I said, well, this is just ridiculous. So I used the Liberal Party's
Because you weren't
internal.
you weren't a parliamentarian or
No, just a
at
rank
this
and
point,
file
you're just a
member.
member of the
Yeah,
Liberal Party,
that's right. And I said, well,
regular
this is
rank and file.
rubbish. This is rubbish.
Yeah.
So I drafted a motion with some friends of mine, more libertarian thinking friends of mine in the Liberal Party, some of whom are no longer members either. And we put forward this motion at what's called State Council, which is a large membership body of about 1,300 people in Victoria. So it's
Okay.
more senior members of the Liberal. Let's say they've got 10,000 members. I doubt they've got that many these days, but let's say they do. It's say 10% of the party is represented at State Council and members of Parliament. So it's quite a senior body.
What's its role
It's
like
like
in the?
it's the party's AGM, if I can put it that way. So
Okay.
they generally have two per year. One metropolitan Melbourne, one is more in a regional or rural area. But it's where
So you were representing a cluster of
I was
other
representing my
members
local
beneath
area.
you?
Yeah, I was a delegate effectively from my local
Right.
area, and
Yep.
every part of Victoria has delegates that they send to this, and that's where the state president gets elected, and that's it's the AGM. It's the peak membership, broader membership body, effectively.
Yes. Okay. I understand. Yep.
But they have policy motions, right? That's one of the things that they do in addition to elections for internal positions. They
You would
have
hope those
policy
two things
debate and
go
policy
together.
motions. And
Yeah.
so I put up a policy motion saying we need to just abandon this legislation.
Mm.
And in the lead up to it, there was a lot of media coverage. A friend of mine, John Adams, was very vocal
John
about
Adams
it.
was doing a lot of work for it. Yeah, he
he was
really
certainly
fighting the good cause.
and there was a lot of media attention around. And I'm somebody that was media trained, wanting to be a journalist. I'm very open with talking to the media. If a journalist calls me and wants to talk about what I'm doing, I've got no issue telling them what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. But the Liberal Party does not like that. And if you are a rank and file member of the Liberal Party and you're quoted in an article that let's say is attacking the treasurer or the assistant treasurer for moving a ridiculous policy like a cash ban, they're not going to be very happy with you. But in the end, the party membership supported my motion. And so it kind of shut that up pretty quickly because, here you've got the majority of the rank and file membership who ultimately decide which members of the party they're going to send to Parliament. And there were threats about pre-selections as well for existing members of Parliament. They had to cave to the pressure, and I'm glad that they did. But, that
like
was
you
an
said,
eye-opener too about how the process works.
Yeah, but this, I mean, this is a classic issue of something that you would have thought that between the two sides of politics, the Liberals would have been on the no, you don't do that. Labor can do whatever it wants to do. Where did you get the sense this came? I mean, at the time, from my recollection, this was an international issue. They were trying to do this throughout Europe. There were suggestions in America of it as well. It was WEF, UN, all of these big globalist organizations were all talking about the dangers of cash. And then it went into COVID, where it's like, oh, good, cash could give you COVID, nonsense like that. Hand over a piece of plastic because that can't carry a virus, but cash somehow can. But where did you get the sense that came from? Well, there was no sense where that came from, that the party had decided this was the policy and the rank and file just have to get in line.
Well, I think if you ask the members of Parliament and if they answered honestly, which I don't think they would.
No, that's why I'm asking you.
Which tells you how little I probably think of those particular politicians.
It's just the truth, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if they were honest about it, they would say that it's come out of the bureaucracy. And you saw that with the hearings that took place and the public submissions. There were submissions from elements of the bureaucracy, whether it was Treasury or, whatever body is responsible for, money laundering. I think, it was Austrac or something like that. I don't know what it's called anymore. And they said, this legislation is essential for us to do our job at stopping money laundering. They trot out all of the data about this. And, money laundering is against the law, right? And
that's
committing a criminal offence, if it's already a criminal offence, it's already against the law. The fact that you used cash to do it is, it's like, I mean, there were so many great
lines
seemed like at the time. It was like, criminals breathe oxygen. Are we going to ban that too?
That's right.
At what point are you willing to give away your liberties in order to get a bit of security in the form of, there's no more money laundering anymore because we can just track everything?
And we know it's nonsense.
And there's the old quote, I don't know where the quote's from, but the people that give up both liberty and security to
Yeah,
serve
liberty
neither.
for safety wind up with neither,
Yeah, we
correct,
might
yeah.
wind up with neither, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was certainly the case I found with the cash ban. But you're right, many governments, around the world were implementing it.
Yeah, yeah. It struck me again, there's another agenda when just on its face, the argument is just utterly ridiculous. And it's like, do you really think that the local heroin dealer is going to go, oh, I'm very sorry, you can't give me more than $10,000 cash for my heroin that I'm illegally supplying you with because that's against the law? It's just like the gun issue. It's like, do you really think that the bikies with the guns shooting up the other club really give a damn that there's a law against the? It doesn't affect the people it's supposed to.
No.
That comes back to the issue about the bureaucracy that I started with and the deep state. They're getting these ideas from somewhere and pushing them upwards rather than the top pushing the
Well,
ideas
you're right.
down.
It's not grassroots. Certainly not grassroots. Nobody's out there asking for
Correct.
cash to be banned. But
No.
look at Victoria at the moment. What the state government is doing around these machete laws.
Yeah.
It boggles my mind. I mean, stabbing somebody
That's right.
is
Yeah.
a criminal offence,
That's not
right? And
enough against the law.
you should be charged. If you stab somebody, you should be
That's right.
charged, and
Yeah.
you should be put in jail after a fair trial. Obviously, that's what we believe in.
Well, we've got to move from machetes onto pencils because John Wick killed people with pencils. So,
Well,
obviously pencils
this is the bizarre thing. Like, I mean, nobody's out there saying we need to ban machetes. Actually, that's not a grassroots policy, and that's also not going to.
Yeah.
That's not a solution to the problem. I mean, your problem is that you've got criminals on the street doing crimes, and there's no penalty for those crimes that they're committing. I mean,
Yeah, the police aren't charging them.
there's a direct parallel here with the cash ban because at the time we were arguing exactly this around money laundering. Oh, you've got criminals using large quantities of cash to go about their business. Why don't you just go and catch the criminals and charge them for the criminal offences? Trying to make
Exactly.
everybody's lives harder by banning cash. I'm sorry, bureaucrats, that's the lazy way out. Do your job, find the criminals, and
Yes.
don't expect everybody else to give up their rights and liberties so that your job can be just a little bit easier.
Did you get the sense from what you've seen then that it simply in a lot of cases is the bureaucracy trying to find excuses to expand its own reach and power? There's not really any malicious intent behind it. It's just,
well, I mean that there's another saying about don't assign malevolence when stupidity will do. But governments over time do expand their power and do increase in size, and we don't have very good limits on the size and power of government in Australia. I wish we had more. The US Constitution is probably the best document in living history of limits on government power. The government can still ignore elements of that, obviously. I wish we had stronger protections against the size and power of government because, as I say, over time, they do prescribe more and more laws. Speaking of Senate hearings, there's a clip of Kerry Packer from many years ago in front of a Senate committee, a hearing. And I think it's into media ownership because at the time he was trying to buy a media company, and we have laws about competition and how much media one person is allowed to own and control. And he basically said, I think every time you pass a new law, he was talking to politicians and serving up, you should have to repeal an old one. And he said in his time, he thinks that you must have had tens and tens of thousands of pages of new laws. And he says, I don't think anybody really understands these laws. You've increased them by a multiple of 10 or 100, but I don't think our lives have improved in terms of life quality by 10 times or 100 times. And that's the problem with creeping government, is that actually as the size of government expands, the size of the individual shrinks. And that, that's libertarian at its core, actually.
Would you believe at the moment the Australian government is adding an additional approximately 3 laws per week, 3 new laws every week of every year. and it's been going on for more than 100 years. It's 139 laws a year, I think, at the moment. It's just being added onto what's already there. It just keeps on going and going and going. It's insane.
It
But
doesn't.
sorry,
It's not making our lives, you know.
no. Well, it's making them worse.
Exactly.
Obviously,
Yeah.
it just keeps getting.
At the end of the day, they're taking rights and freedoms away and increasing the size of government.
You can see that in the shrinking of the percentage of the economy that's small business and the increasing of the economy that is just government. It's just a giant bureaucratic state that it's becoming, and it's harder and harder to do business every single year.
Well, the other thing about the size of government, I mean, and this is, another reason why I ran for council, is I actually really love local government. As libertarians, one of the things that we believe in is devolved democracy, which is this idea that important government decisions should be made at the most local level, ideally by the people who are most affected by those decisions.
Most affected by it.
And so that would actually mean, in theory, you'd have a very powerful local government, which probably comes as a shock to many people. That's not what a lot of people want. In fact, many people say they want to abolish council altogether. What that does is it takes it. Local governments are decentralized power. It would take power away from the local level, and it would centralize it in a central bureaucracy. Whether if it's in Victoria, it's in Spring Street. If it's federally, it's in Canberra, where bureaucrats are based hundreds, thousands of kilometres away, not attached to the communities that are affected by the decisions that are being made.
Yeah.
And so I love local government because it's that front level, it's that first level of representative government. And that's where decisions can really make or break people's livelihoods, actually. A bad planning decision at a council level can really ruin your local amenity and how much you peacefully enjoy your property, which is, one of your property rights. Or if you are homeless, chances are it's you and you're rocking up for a meal every week at a local kitchen. Chances are that is funded, if not run, by your local council. And so that direct level of government is really important. And it's an issue that it's a conversation I've had with many people, because people have said to me, "You're a libertarian. Why are you in councils? Councils are just bloated bureaucracies, whatever." Councils represent approximately 3% of the tax revenue in Australia. 3%. State governments are about 17%, and the federal government is 80%. And so if you want to know where the mass of government is, it's not at a local council level.
No.
And so I'd have this debate with people a lot. It's like, well, if you're a libertarian, you'd probably abolish federal and state way before you ever abolish local government. Yeah. And in fact, there'd be many libertarians out there saying only local government, that's it, abolish the rest. It was a question I was interested in.
Well, if you take away the word government and just go, it's essentially a collective which is at a local level of some form. It's the people of that community getting together to just go, this is what we agree amongst ourselves that we want for ourselves. That's libertarianism the word in a nutshell.
Collective, because we don't like collectivism.
No, we don't like collectivism, but
look, it's a worthy debate to have. It's certainly government, though, because the idea is that it's passing rules or bylaws in the case of local council that do govern people. It was a topic I was interested in because I put up a poll on my Facebook page when I was a councillor and said, which of the three levels of government would you abolish? And I thought it was going to be overwhelmingly in favour of abolishing councils. You hear about it all the time. You read about it. Actually, people said they'd abolish state governments. And I don't know if that's off the back of the pandemic and people in Australia realising just how powerful their state governments are when they perhaps didn't realise, and they are powerful. That goes back to those residual powers from the Constitution. Anything not mentioned is up to the state governments, which makes them very powerful. But yeah, I was expecting people to say abolish council, but maybe they're looking at models like New Zealand or the United Kingdom, which don't really have that. Well, New Zealand definitely doesn't, and UK's got a very strange model because they're three countries. But they effectively have a national government and then a local government, nothing in between that. And certainly because of what I just mentioned with 3%, 17% and 80%, the fastest way to reduce taxes and to reduce government in Australia would be to abolish either state or federal. But
that's right.
I think that these are just for libertarians at the moment, it's a bit of a pipe dream, unfortunately. I'm very pragmatic when it comes to my politics, and was when I was a councillor, but I think the likelihood of abolishing any level of government in Australia is probably slim. Australians seem to really like government, actually.
They do. Yeah. Yeah. What is that about? Because we complain about them constantly, and they keep making our life more and more difficult. And yet Australians just seem to reflexively look on government to fix all of the problems that they see came from government. It's a
Yeah.
bizarre Stockholm syndrome or something.
It is
I'm
a
not
little
sure
bit.
what it
I
is.
don't, I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, we can speculate on it. Australia never really had its, breakaway moment. There was no,
Mm,
there was no war with the UK over,
mm,
give us our autonomy. I mean, there was the
yeah.
Eureka Stockade, which I understand is basically, a rebellion against taxation. But that wasn't really national. There's been no civil war here yet, although sometimes Victoria and New South Wales, probably want to go. If we did abolish state government, Victoria and New South Wales could finally have the civil war that they probably wanted all along.
Always wanted.
Yeah, I think it's not in our DNA, and I think Australia being a very egalitarian society, we like this idea that it's mateship. We like the idea that we're all mates and that we all live under the same system and follow the same rules.
Mm.
And Australians like the idea that government is there reinforcing those rules. There's a quote in Donald Horne's book Lucky Country about Australia being, a lucky country run by basically mediocre people who share in its luck. And
It's a good
it's an old
description.
quote. I come back to that quote a lot
Yeah.
because I think it is fairly accurate.
Apt.
The quality of our, not to say that there's, to be honest, many other countries have it much better, but the quality of some of our politicians is just appalling, and it seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, but it's a lot like Europe, which you would just you look at Europe right now and you just go, what an utter disgrace. It's like, apart from perhaps Orban and Hungary, there's not a single logical, rational, intelligent, statesman-like person anywhere to be seen.
Well, and the ones that
Starmer, von der
are,
Leyen, Macron, you look at all of them and
yeah.
they're corrupt as corrupt could
Well, the
be.
ones that
They,
are strong leaders are just, it's like that they've forgotten that there's another axis to the political compass, and
that's correct.
the media is guilty of this all the time. They talk about left versus right or progressive versus conservative. And one of the things I, like to do all the time is to remind people that there's another axis. You're not just talking about the, horizontal axis or left versus right. There's the, there's the y-axis as
Authoritarianism
well,
versus
which is
liberty.
exactly, or
Yeah.
authoritarian versus libertarian.
Yeah.
And using the Australian example, you'd expect the Liberal Party to be more on the libertarian end of that axis versus authoritarian.
Well, the word liberal did
Yeah,
originally
it
mean
should
that.
be a dead giveaway there. But in Victoria and nationally at the moment, our opposition leader in Victoria is Brad Batten, who I've known for a while, and he's a nice person. And I think he'd make certainly a better premier than the one we've currently got. He's a former police officer, very similar to Dutton, who's also a former police officer. Dutton I don't know personally, although I have met him. Friends of mine that work for him or know him personally speak very highly of him. But my sense is with, in particular, former police officers, and my grandfather was a police officer. I've got lots of friends that are police or former police. It's nothing against them personally, but they seem to lean on the side of we can rely on government to get the job done here. And you see this with Peter Dutton in particular, nationally. An issue pops up. Let's say, okay, well, this is a good example. Young people using social media, right? What's the solution here?
Yep.
Libertarian will say, well, that's up to the parents to get a handle on that.
Yep.
Their child is affected by something that's going on. That's the parents' responsibility to do that, to fix that problem. The local level, where the child is most directly affected by it locally, not in Canberra. Peter Dutton's default option is, well, we can come up with a new piece of legislation to fix that problem.
Yeah.
And that's my
No.
concern, is that increasingly politicians nationally at state level, even in the Liberal Party, sit on the authoritarian side of the y-axis and not the libertarian side of the y-axis, which then exacerbates the problem of growing government and bigger government and growing bureaucracy and higher taxes. I mean, we saw this just this week with the budget, right? The Federal Liberal Party came out and said, we're not going to support Labor's permanent income tax cut. Now, it was a paltry, pathetic tax cut of like 1%
This
this year,
goes for
1%
70
next year,
cents a week
whatever
or
it is.
whatever it is, something
The
crazy.
vast majority of people, it's going to be absolutely nothing. But it was still a permanent tax cut, right? You'd expect the Liberal Party to come out and say, we support this, but it doesn't go far enough.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll support your tax cut, which is a permanent one, like a legislative, not a one-off, permanent reduction from 15 to 14% is the bracket or something like that.
Yep.
But they came out and opposed it. And we're not going to support the tax cut. They're completely antithetical to their entire political platform.
Correct.
Of lower taxes.
Yeah. Now,
this is a hypothetical question, but can you explain that to me? Because it doesn't make any sense. And there were just so many moments, Damon, as a member of the Liberal Party, that I thought, this is just not where it's at. And so in the end, I didn't renew my membership. And that was while I was the mayor, actually, of the show. I just had enough. I don't want to be involved in that anymore. There were many things.
It doesn't represent what you were joining on to.
No, exactly. And my values haven't changed, right? I've been, if you'd asked me when I was 17, I probably didn't know what a libertarian was, but that's what my values were.
Correct.
I discovered at some point that's what it is. And so that's what I called myself. It's one of the only labels I like to subscribe to. Somebody that doesn't like labels, but I even tried at one point within the Liberal Party to start a Libertarian branch, which was just for libertarians, of which there are a lot in the Liberal Party, could come together just socially, administratively, and meet, say, once a month to talk about libertarian policies to progress those particular...
Within the Liberal Party.
Yeah, within the Liberal Party, those particular policies within the party. And my own faction within the Liberal Party knocked that on the head and rejected the creation of a libertarian branch inside the Liberal Party. And looking back in hindsight now, I just shake my head because I'm just like, well, these people...
The irony of it, like I say, because the original, like a classical liberal was when I bothered opening the dictionary and going, well, what am I politically? It was a classical liberal, but you wouldn't dare call yourself that anymore because of what the liberals in
And that's what
America
the Liberal Party always was.
known
It was the classical Liberal Party, which has
is
a lot
libertarian.
in common with libertarians. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's probably a few things, where they're not quite there, but for the vast majority,
it's a long way down the road to libertarianism, and
Exactly.
anarcho-capitalism is just
it's
the next
certainly
stop
on the correct side of the y-axis on the political compass, as opposed to where the Liberal Party is now. The distinction or the lack thereof between the major parties in Australia now is really concerning. It's meaning that important issues, immigration is one of them, and there's lots of fierce debates amongst libertarians about immigration, because typically libertarians don't like the idea of having borders and restricted immigration.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
It's a big issue my philosophy has always been, if you don't have borders, then you don't have a country, right? I mean, that's the crux.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's
my thing with it. To quickly interject, I don't understand how you can have an ideology that's based on private property and then not recognize the demarcation of the ultimate property. I really would have thought it's as simple as that. It's just like, I can't just walk onto your property without invitation and do whatever the hell that I want there. So wouldn't that just apply at a larger scale to the borders of the country? That's what the border is. It's the border.
Well, that would be the
property.
Extrapolation, is that the borders of a country are protecting the culture and also the values that a country has been founded on, basically.
Sure, but coming down to a libertarian thing, you just go, it's a piece of property, and in terms of having an army and defending from attackers and all the rest of it, it's like this is relevant to a piece of land, the same way that within a country you have a piece of land which you should be able to defend by whatever means you want. They come onto your land, now that's an invasion of some sort, unless you've invited them on there. If you ask them to exit, they need to kindly exit.
Yeah.
And we've got all of these laws also saying, if you want to come into the country, you can come into the country, but you need to have a visa. You need to have an approval process that you go through. And the idea that a whole lot of people just don't need to abide by the laws of the country that apply to everybody else who tries to come in, just baffles me. It's
Well, I think it goes much deeper than that, and this is where it starts to get tricky. Is that you could be opening up your country to immigration. Let's say your country is founded on the principle of liberty, right? A pretty important one that I hope is part of Australia's core values and forever is, at least as long as I'm alive. What if you are opening up your country to immigrants that don't subscribe to that as a key value for your country? Now that's a big problem, right? But this
it's
is
going
such
to
a
cause problems. Yeah.
this would be a great debate to have as an independent podcast between two opposing libertarians, because, as I say, libertarians typically don't like rules or the idea that government has the power to prevent freedom of movement, for example, which is a key libertarian issue.
Sure.
Which effectively, but going back to the point about immigration more broadly, this is a key issue for a lot of people, especially a lot of young people. There's virtually no difference between the two major parties in Australia on immigration.
No. Yeah.
This is an important issue that's not going to be debated over the next 5 weeks of the election campaign.
No.
Because what's the point of debating it? Because whether you get the blue team or the red team, you're getting the same outcome either way.
You're getting the same policy. Yeah.
And this is a growing problem in Australia with the major parties.
And so this actually comes into my next point, which is to do with the media. That, I mean, using this as an issue, we don't have to look that far around the world to see that this open border policy has just been an absolute unmitigated disaster everywhere. It doesn't matter your feelings on certain things when crime spikes 1,000% and there's rapes and murders and property prices are no longer affordable and homeless, and there's a litany of problems that come off of the back of that need to be decided upon. And the media seems to be the main driving force behind saying anyone who disagrees with this policy is a bigot and anyone who talks about the crime is racist, et cetera, et cetera. Dutton, it appears to me, not having really cared or studied the man too much, but it seems to me that he, as of more recently, and you can correct me, please, but he's sort of shifted to appease this type of the mainstream narrative that's pumped out by the media. Would that appears to be what I've seen happened? It's not necessarily what his views ever were.
No, I think that's right. I think that's correct. I think he leans on the side of significantly lower immigration. That's just my personal view of his personal view, especially because he was at one time immigration minister and home affairs minister and was basically central to the whole stop the boat, strong borders policy, along with Scott Morrison, actually, before he became prime minister. That was during Tony Abbott's era. So I think he does lean towards that. But, I think that there's a number of motivating factors there that you see, because I've seen this debate play out on social media and in the mainstream media as well about why are politicians so weak on this particular subject. And I think, to the first point you made, I think a lot of them are afraid of being called racist and xenophobic, which, in terms of immigration, as somebody that was a local mayor that did citizenship ceremonies regularly, they were some of my favourite things to do. The vast majority of immigration in my area, might be different elsewhere, is still coming from the United Kingdom and New Zealand. So it's not going to be a race thing there, certainly not. The second thing is you've got a disproportionate number of members of parliament that own a disproportionate number of properties, as in homes. So there is a self-interest there, incentive there, to ensure that we continue to have population growth, because of what is a third reason is that immigration has basically been underpinning our entire economy. We would actually be in recession right now without it. Now, recessions are a normal thing. They should be allowed to occur, but bureaucrats and politicians don't like the idea of recessions.
Yeah,
politicians are petrified of them and will do basically, especially in Australia where we have not had one, nobody wants to be the first. So it's a bit like pass the parcel, and they'll desperately try to do everything they can to prevent one, including allowing a ridiculous amount of immigration. And then there's a fourth one which people often don't consider, and it's something I can talk to, having been a member of the Liberal Party for as long as I was. And I've talked to some people in other states of Australia too, and apparently it's the same there. There's a huge amount of influence that migration agents have on our political parties. People listening to this will kind of go, what are you talking about? Like, so
Yeah.
migration agents are people that basically help people get visas.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to move to a different country, you can talk to a migration agent in that country to help you get permanent residency or to get the relevant visa, or how to become then put you on the track to become a citizen, and all the things you've got to do in order to migrate. That's the role of a migration agent. Apparently, in both parties, I can only speak about my experience in the Liberal Party, but apparently Labor is the same. Migration agents run rampant and hold very senior positions within the party. And I was asking a few people about why this is, and apparently political parties in Australia now rely on massive amounts of new Australians joining their rank and file. It's basically where they're getting the majority of their new members now. And migration agents holding senior office bearer positions are exerting too much, frankly, in my opinion, influence on the internal processes of our major parties. And it's one out of left field that people possibly wouldn't consider, but people that have been
No.
involved in a party would probably be able to name people, whether it's on their party executive or office bearers. And I know that person. They work as a migration agent. That's their profession, and they seem to be overrepresented in both major parties. It's a remarkable thing that the media doesn't really have a clue about what's going on either there.
Okay, that's really interesting. Going back to the am I misunderstanding the migration issue then? Because my understanding is, if I'm a Canadian engineer and I want to move to Australia permanently, become a resident, it's unbelievably difficult for me to do that. University qualified, able to support myself, small business owner, whatever it is, it's unbelievably difficult. But somehow I thought the migration that was actually taking place was illegal migration. It's boats
No,
coming
not in
in from
Australia.
third world nations.
No, not in Australia. Certainly not.
Not anymore.
No,
It's just
no.
open to everybody now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the way to enter Australia illegally, really the only way now Tony Abbott stopped the boats. That was his slogan.
Yes.
Would be by airplane. It's quite difficult to do that because you have to have papers and documentation and your visa on arrival. So illegal immigration is not a thing in Australia. It's all legal immigration, and it's to the tune of 750,000 people a year, or it was up until recently. And
That's
I know what
why
you're
I thought
saying.
that this is what we were talking about, because no one's really specifying where these people are coming from, but it seems to be not vetted, high quality people that you want to be coming.
Politicians will say they have been vetted and that they are high quality people, and it's all skilled migration. And politicians will say that we need more of it.
And what does the community say about the people?
The average Australian will wonder why that's the case. I mean, you hear businesses and business lobby groups in particular, say that the process to bring out, in your example, a Canadian engineer, we've got a shortage of engineers, we need more engineers to come to Australia. Well, do we have a shortage of engineers? Or is it that you just don't want to pay enough in order to hire an Australian? Or is it that, you're not creating enough local demand, and so therefore students are not going to university to become engineers because they know the job won't be there at the end of their degree for them because you've hired an experienced migrant because it's cheaper or more effective to do that. The complaints around the difficulty to get visas, I've heard this. I can't speak to it myself, having never done the process, but I just simply do not see how that's the case. Given the sheer number of people coming to Australia, I don't see how it can be difficult. I think it might be a bureaucratic thing. The fee might be a lot. The paperwork might be cumbersome, but the sheer number of migrants coming to Australia, skilled migrants, and getting visas, and also students, it's enormous. So it can't be that difficult.
Well, the students I can understand because that's a major export market.
It is.
Because I'm not living in Australia, and I see the squabbles about the immigration and the huge numbers, and I assumed it was the same issue as seen here in Europe,
certainly not.
which is all.
Yeah, I know.
It's
I know what you're
completely
saying
different.
about the European issue. The issue of illegal immigration has not really been a problem in Australia for a long time since Tony Abbott stopped the boats, basically, and the government did that.
But so
I would be shocked if illegal arrivals, numbered in the tens of thousands, let alone the levels of immigration that we have been seeing in Australia.
So what about the roving gangs of people committing violent crimes on?
They're Australians. They're, either permanent residents or Australian citizens. And if we're talking about young people in particular in Victoria,
Yeah.
I've never seen a roving gang, but the crimes are there. But I've known people that have woken up in their home not far from me where I live, with people standing over them in their bedroom with a knife to their neck, demanding their car keys.
Yeah.
But these are Australian citizens. These are not immigrants, and this is as a result of a weak criminal justice system that is simply not doling out the consequences for committing criminal offences.
Because the sort of situation that you're talking about in Brighton and upmarket affluent areas like that.
That's the one making the headlines, but it's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, but I understand that it's spread far and wide. But certainly the friend of mine who almost died and went to hospital in critical condition for a month, the gang that beat him up in the park in Melbourne, let's just say they weren't local Australians. And
you're saying that they weren't citizens.
No, I'm not saying they weren't citizens. I'm saying that visibly they didn't appear to be, locals.
That would be a different issue. At the end of the day, though, what I'm suggesting is the majority of these people will be Australian citizens. So dealing with the issue of immigration is not going to resolve that problem ultimately when people are here. And if Australian citizens are committing crimes, that would be a separate issue to the immigration.
Obviously it is. Okay, so the issue is the government letting more skilled migrants come into Australia, but in these absolutely astronomical quantities.
Well, I think for a long period of time, a barista, like coffee barista, was on the list of things that you could get a visa for. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, any person trained can be a barista. Why would we need to hand out a visa in order to get more barista? It doesn't make sense to the average person. Doesn't pass the pub test. But you'll get businesses and business lobby groups saying we need more of this. But what it does is it puts an artificial dampener on wages. Basically, it keeps wages low. When you're funneling more people in to the Ponzi scheme, what you're doing is two things. You're keeping wages low, which big business in particular would be very happy about. But you're also creating more working age Australians, which is solving the problem we've got in Australia of the ageing population and the fact that we have the biggest welfare expense to the federal government is the age pension. And we have fewer and fewer working age Australians funding ever increasing numbers of age pensioners. And the age pension is a Ponzi scheme. That's actually the way it's designed. It relies, it's not like superannuation where you pay into it over your lifetime and then draw down from it. Today's taxpayers are paying today's pensioners. So if you lose today's taxpayers or don't have enough of today's taxpayers, you're not going to be able to fund that bill, which is funded on an annual basis.
And if you don't have another,
so the government is also desperately afraid of that. In addition to recession, is running out of enough working age people in order to fund our ever increasing age pension needs.
Theoretically, increasing the population, I mean, notwithstanding the housing crisis issue, which is probably the primary problem coming off of the back of it, but that is essential to non-stop growth of an economy, is that there's a presumption that there's going to be non-stop growth of the population.
Well, I mean, that's probably a flawed view, which probably a lot of people do hold. That I mean, even in recession, there are sectors that grow, right? Even though the economy as a whole might shrink in a recession, there are sectors of growth, and recessions are naturally occurring because you need that opportunity to allow inefficient, ineffective, unwanted businesses to effectively hit the
creative
wall.
Destruction.
Because if they're not profitable, then they're not efficient and they're not effective and they're not needed. So they're a drag on the economy. But if you don't have a recession, you sort of
but that's what I mean.
In process anymore.
In order to have continuing growth, if you assume a flatlined population, then you would need to increase efficiency, would be the only other way. And not doing a hell of a lot go in the right
And
direction of
it would be a very difficult thing to do in Australia because our economy is effectively based on digging holes and selling the dirt to China. A
yeah,
very simple economy, which is up there with some third world countries in terms of its economic complexity. And there's a lot of
yes,
data around that. For a first world country, we have very poor, very low economic complexity,
mm.
which is a big problem, especially if you want to get productivity up. There was a surprise announcement in the budget from Labor about, which is advice they took from the Productivity Commission, which is to abolish this idea around non-compete clauses, which is
I saw
popping up
this.
everywhere, and
Yeah,
it's a fascinating one because I think a lot of libertarians would be supportive of this policy because it's effectively means that you as an individual can't be stopped by your former employer from going and working in the same industry or what have you.
that
You know,
you're
it's more of
skilled
a
in.
free
Yeah,
market, and that's
yes,
competition. You know, if you're
yeah,
not a good business, you're going to lose your best employees. If you don't
yes.
pay a competitive salary, then you're going to lose those people as well. So, you know, I think it's a great move. It was a surprising move by the Labor Party. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it might be driven by the unions that probably deal with their members with a lot of these issues that come up with employees that have perhaps been sacked or made redundant or whatever, and find that there's these ridiculous non-compete clauses, even if they're a low-level employee in their employment contract, and they can't start up a consultancy or their own business or work in a similar field. So the
Mm.
Productivity Commission obviously realised this, and they said, well, we need to get rid of this because it's actually stopping employees from having a bit of power and autonomy in what they do, and then it's a dampener on productivity. So that's an interesting one from Labor. But there's not there's there's not much Australia can do in terms of very quickly to improve its economic complexity. We've got an economy that's dependent on resources, which is a blessing and a curse in some
And
ways.
a curse. Yeah, well, ultimately, the way I've seen it for a while, and one of the reasons that I left is that I think Australia is overdue for the mother of all recessions and a cleaning house of just an unsustainable model that's going to be very
Well,
ugly.
well,
I
the
can't.
curse, I mean, we all know what the blessings are of having a resource-rich country. I mean, I think there's effectively, of the resources we know of, and there's a lot that's undiscovered. Um, of the resources we know of, there's something like $750,000 of resources and minerals in the ground for every Australian, and that's a huge. We should be the wealthiest country on the planet.
Yeah,
We're
per
not.
capita. Yeah,
There's a whole lot of problems for that need to be fixed in terms of the mediocre politicians, which we referenced earlier. But the curse is obviously that as an export nation, that we rely very heavily on a country like China purchasing our resources. And as the saying goes, if China gets a sniffle, then Australia catches a cold. And I think that would probably the number one risk for a recession in Australia is slowed economic growth in China and a situation where they're not buying the resources at the same level that they currently are.
yeah, which makes it seem strange to me that we're beating our chests and threatening China that in 20 years we're going to have us submarines, so they better watch their back because we're going to kick their ass. I always sort of thought that
Well,
was a
it's a question. It's a question of, is China an expanding power? You know, and there's debate on both sides of that. Libertarians probably want to talk more about the non-aggression principle and whether it's right that Australia is involved in all sorts of conflicts around the world, including Ukraine, and also the question of how much Australia should be spending on its military. It's an interesting topic from my perspective as a young person and somebody that would, for example, be of conscription age. So you do tend to think about these things. Uh, if you asked a lot of young people, you know, would you fight for Australia? I think you'd find a significant proportion of them would say no. And so the question is, why? And, there's probably two elements of that I can think of. The first would be, well, you're fighting for some politicians you don't particularly like.
Yes.
And so,
100%.
let's say you don't particularly like the Prime Minister. Probably everyone listening to this podcast is in that boat.
Yep.
Would you go to war for the Prime Minister? Probably
Not a
not.
chance.
Nobody's going to do any favors
Yeah.
for him. And then the
War
second
on
thing
the
is
Prime
this.
Minister, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, and the second thing is the breakdown of what's called the social contract. This is why home ownership is such a big thing. Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party, recognised this is an important thing. The Liberal Party has completely lost its way on this. The policy direction in terms of increasing home ownership is next to non-existent. I mean, using your superannuation, fine, it's your money, whatever. But all you're doing there is basically creating demand. You're not fixing the supply problem, and then at the same time you're creating more of a demand issue because you don't want to talk about immigration and other policy drivers. But if a young person doesn't own a piece of land in Australia, what buy-in do they have to this country? Like, what are they actually?
True.
What are they fighting for?
Yeah, what are they fighting for?
And not even to not. You can bring it right back to the local level. What are they voting for?
Yeah.
Why are more young people not? Why don't they care about what's happening in government? Why don't they care about the policy? Well, because maybe they don't care about the country as a whole. Why don't they care about the country as a whole? Well, they don't have buy-in. If you own a property, suddenly you care about the state of the road outside your street, the state of the lawn it's in. You want to make sure that it's looking good. You care about the schools that are in the local area and access to a high quality hospital. You care about what the main street looks like and the businesses that are there and that you've got access to.
Makes so
You
much
care
sense.
about the immediate vicinity around you, and therefore you care about your country and the policies that affect all that is in your immediate vicinity. If you don't own a property in Australia, if you don't own a piece of this country as a young person, what is your incentive to care about the country?
It's so true. But it's even worse than that, isn't it? Because they're coming out of school now laden with debt. So not only do you not own,
precisely,
but apparently you owe, and you need to work for your slave owner effectively.
Precisely. Peter Costello actually talked about this not long ago. In the there's HECS debt, and then there's also government debt, which future generations are expected to pay.
Yeah, that's right.
What an unbelievable disservice to every young Australian, every future Australian, that they are saddled with this. And there's talk about it in America. There's a big debate about boomers, for example, and Donald Trump is a boomer, but boomers have held power for a long time. But first the global financial crisis, then the pandemic, as possibly in America as the two big economic events, ran up massive bills on the credit card, funding in America Social Security and infrastructure, and they want to drive on nice roads, and they want to have fast trains or whatever. That's all been paid for by the credit card. So future generations are actually funding that. Future generations and young people are funding the lifestyle that older Australians are enjoying today, to bring it back to the local example. And that's certainly a big problem. And again, is the breaking down of what's called the social contract.
Yeah.
This idea that if you're going to buy into Australia and you're going to buy into the protection of Australia and Australia's values, what is the country going to give you in return? What? The inability to buy a home and a massive debt, which you'll be paying via huge income taxes. Effectively, that's the case in Australia. It's not a very good deal for young people at the moment, and
they're also being indoctrinated with, and it keeps on moving out, of course. But in 12 years, there's the end of the world because of driving SUVs, and
that's happened. That's happened very quickly. I mean, I don't remember it being as bad as and I'm not that old. I don't like to think that I'm that old as 32-year-old. So I was in high school only 12 years ago, or 14 years ago. But I think it's changed massively. I don't remember it being as bad as what it seems to currently be.
No,
it's certainly got a lot worse. But it's a tough conversation to have, because immediately it pits generation against generation, and you'll have a situation where boomers will say, "Oh, well, in my day I had 18% interest rates, and we didn't have smartphones and the internet, and We didn't have modern medicines and things like that, and that's all true. Obviously, it's not taking any of that away, any of the difficult circumstances that previous generations have had. It's obviously the case. But the problem is, in a country like Australia, the social contract is this idea that your children and your grandchildren will have a better life than you have, right? And you can't
Right.
tell me that that's not what older Australians want. I mean, do you want your children to have a better life than you've got? Because what we're facing at the moment is the first generation of Australians that are my age, the older millennials, that are going to be worse off than their parents.
And dramatically so.
And that is a complete breakdown of the social contract. And it actually erodes at the heart of a country like Australia, which says that we are not only going to be a country based on liberty and reward for effort and on all those sorts of values, but the idea that we will make the world a better place than it was when we ourselves inherited it. And if that contract's broken, then you don't have a country. And it goes back to that discussion we had before about would you fight to protect it? Well, increasingly, I think young Australians would say no, and also young Australians have lost faith in democracy too, which is a big problem because then they start to turn towards more authoritarian forms of government because they see democracy as the problem. And in some ways it is, and we need to reform democracy in some ways because it is failing us. But it's the worst system other than all the rest.
Other than all the rest, that's right. Yeah. So, all right. So to close out then, what chance does Australia have to actually solve this and start heading back in the right direction? What are your policy ideas or just ideas in general for it?
It's not a good question to ask me, Damon, because I'm a pessimist.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get
I'm still waiting for someone to answer the question in a way that I go, you're right, I'm coming back. It's got a great chance. It's like,
Australia doesn't have a reform movement that I can see waiting in the wings for us.
No.
As yet. So I'm not optimistic in the short term. I'm optimistic probably in the long term. Look, in terms of policy changes I'd like to see made, I mean, perhaps the way
and what I'm asking with that is, sorry, it's just where does it start? Like, we can look at the whole thing being a shambles, but it's sort of like what policies could be put in place as of now that would steer the ship in a better direction than where it's headed right now?
I think it has to start with liberty. It has to start with the idea that our politicians and government, include the bureaucracy in that, enjoys power given to it by the people on a temporary basis. And every election they have to ask for that power, they have to ask for that power back. The elections are our check. What's going wrong there where, perhaps it's not being checked or Australians are maybe not paying attention to the increasing size and power of government? There's probably two elements. Electoral reform, and there's certain things that we can look at. Some of them are controversial, and some of them are controversial to libertarians as well. Something like term limits. Now, that's a rule. Libertarians typically don't like rules, but term limits would prevent politicians from sitting in power for such a period of time that they amass too much power and become too entrenched in government. So that
politicians or bureaucrats?
Well, that's the second thing. So, when democracy was first conceived, basically bureaucrats were selected by random selection, by sortition. And there's many books and people I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but basically senior bureaucrats would be randomly selected out of the population, like a jury system.
Really?
And they would hold that position for a certain period of time, and then they'd be randomly selected again. There'd be a whole new set of people, which was an effective term limit. But the idea was that everybody has a role to play in civic duty. Representative democracy in Australia doesn't really make room for that kind of thing. But perhaps we do need some effective term limits at a bureaucratic level that say, well, look, maybe you shouldn't be a public servant for more than a decade. Maybe there should be some kind of lifetime limit on your ability to be a public servant, or the number of years you can, do it consecutively.
Or at least at that senior level, when you're at the management executive level of it, that it's...
And these are, once again, libertarians tend not to like rules, but these are structural rules in place that you would hope would put a cap or a limit on government power and government growing effectively. It works at a presidential level in the United States with term limits there. I think they've been very effective, actually. And people push back and they say, well, what if you get a president you really like, you can't elect them again? It's like, well, at the end of the day, they are a politician. You can find other politicians. There's not going to be a shortage of them.
That's
you can
right.
find other good ones that have got maybe slightly different ideas, but they can have good ideas as well. Other things that other countries, Switzerland is a good example of some things that they do. Citizen-initiated referendums. So the ability for citizens, without the need for government or politicians to propose a referendum like we had in Australia with the Voice referendum. What if 100,000 Australians signed a formal petition, and there's ways of verifying it and making sure that it's legitimate? What if 100,000 Australians signed a petition to have a referendum on a particular policy issue? There's a tension worldwide between representative democracy, which is what we've got,
and direct democracy.
Because the reason the tension exists now is that we have the technology available to have direct democracy.
That's right.
Technologically, there is no reason why you and I sitting at home can't vote on a piece of legislation. And the whole country could do that if they wanted to. Technologically, we're there. It's possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether or not it should be done or is a good thing, that's a separate argument. It's possible.
Yes.
But
whether or not you can trust the politicians not to corrupt the hell out of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Or screw it up.
We have a representative democracy, right? So we elect representatives to go and make those decisions for us. We don't make those decisions.
Yeah.
Right? Which is it can be a tough thing for some people to come to terms to when they're really not happy with the decisions that politicians are making on their behalf. But that's the reason that tension exists. If we could implement some more elements of direct democracy into Australia, I think it'd be very effective. Citizens-initiated referenda. A great one, I think, would be recall elections. We have no ability in Australia to recall a politician if we make a mistake. And a good example of this, which is often pointed to me, is somebody like Senator Lydia Thorpe gets a 6-year term. She abandoned the Greens pretty easily, even though she was elected on the Greens ticket. Even the Greens voters are not happy about that. Why can't you have a situation where a politician is recalled if you get a certain percentage of the population that is not happy with them and wants to have an election to decide whether or not they should actually get to keep their seat? We might have a redo. It's one idea, just an idea that's floated. Another one that is often talked about, optional preferential voting, because we have compulsory preferential voting in Australia. It's something that I've done a 180 on since when I was younger. I thought compulsory voting is fantastic. The major parties love compulsory voting because they don't have to waste time and money encouraging people to vote. It saves them a lot of time knowing that 80 to 90% of people will just rock up anyway and do their duty. But I actually think it's an important thing for government to be able to convince people that they actually should vote in the first place. And at the end of the day, people that aren't passionate or don't care about who they're voting for, you don't really want those people voting, quite frankly.
That's correct. I agree.
Ideally, 100%. Everybody would voluntarily vote, but that's not the world that we live in. And then, another one is public primaries, which the United States has a primary process. People don't realise how easy it would be to implement in Australia because of our compulsory voting system. Everybody's on the electoral roll. So let's say the major parties will never agree to this, right? They like to keep it in-house. At the moment, they select their candidates, right? That's where the power is. If you want to decide who your local Liberal or Labor candidate is, you've actually got to join your Liberal or Labor Party or respective party or the Greens or whoever in order to have a say in who they pre-select. That's why it's called a pre-selection, because they select the candidate before the candidate even goes on the ballot paper. So the parties are very powerful in that process. And that's why it's important people are involved in parties, because increasingly people are not members of parties, and it means you've got fewer and fewer people deciding who the candidates are that end up on the ballot paper. But that's an issue for another day, and I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek as somebody that left a party, but if we had public primaries, members of the public would be able to vote in who the political candidates are. You'd have competition and debate publicly with public participation about who the Liberal candidate was going to be before they were even the candidate, let alone elected as a member of Parliament. At the candidate level, it would be great to have that and quite easy to implement because we've got a universal electoral roll in Australia. All you would have to do is register for your particular party of choice. Let's say I wanted to vote in the Liberal Party primary. I would register with the Electoral Commission as a Liberal Party primary voter, just be another column on the database.
Yeah, okay.
And then the political party itself, the Liberal Party in this example, could run a public primary, which would allow all of those people, a much wider number of people, to vote in a primary. And I think you'd get much more competition. It would be public and transparent, and it'd be a much more competitive process too, which means you'd end up with better candidates rather than the, frankly,
And that way
rubbish
you're
ones.
suggesting allows for more than just the uni party, Labor and Liberal. It means that people can...
Let's say you're a renegade, right? And you've got unpopular views that the Liberal Party doesn't really like, but you've got liberal values. Why should you be excluded from pre-selection simply because the Liberal Party doesn't particularly like having you as a member?
No, but I mean, rather you wouldn't want a primary process if it only reinforces that there's only two parties in the country to vote for and everybody else.
And that's what it
watch.
does in the United States.
It does, yeah.
And it would in Australia because we have a two-party system. But that doesn't, Australia's two-party system doesn't have, it's only like that because that's the way people vote. There's nothing stopping other parties getting elected. And we might even see that after the next federal election if we end up with a minority government with crossbench control. There's nothing in Australia that's really driving that apart from the compulsory preferential system, which ultimately comes down to two-party preferred, and the fact people out of habit vote for the two major parties. But increasingly we're seeing that that's not the case. I think their combined primary is now down to 67% or something, and it's dropping. And so people are turning away from the major parties, and we both know why. I mean,
it's one party. You're not choosing between any of
them.
It's
the uni party, and they're serving up slop, and they're
Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Which do you
increasingly they're sending mediocre people into the parliament that are not, frankly, doing a very good job. Regardless
with the same policies,
regardless of whatever their stated platform is, and they're not sticking to that anyway. So there's plenty of reforms that we could do to democracy to improve things here. The difficulty will be getting any of them.
That's the thing, yeah. Is realistically, there's no incentive for the Labor or the Libs to agree to any of these things because they want to keep control where they've already got control. They don't need to give anything up.
That's right.
And that's where I say, where do you attack that can actually succeed? I would have, when I spoke to Jordan Ditloff last week, I was suggesting that the renewable energy policies are one area where it's hopefully not far enough down the track that it could be stopped, turned around, alternatives found, etc. It's not enough to actually fix the bigger problems. The media would seem to be the biggest problem because that's what's informing the people with just outright lies, straight.
One of the best things libertarians listening to this podcast can do is to get involved and have conversations like the one you and I are having now, and start to put your hand up for positions, including local government. Don't discount it. I think a lot of libertarians do discount council. The major parties, and I include the Greens in that, they use councils as a training ground for future politicians. There's a lot of members of parliament, federal and state level, that have, been former councillors, and it's a great way to get a great understanding of how to win an election, first of all, which you've got to do in order to become a councillor, and then also how government itself actually works with a bureaucracy. You learn very quickly what a bureaucracy is like, how to win some and how to lose some, which you will do often, but it's about also learning how to dust yourself off and quickly move on to the next challenge. Because if you have a loss in the first week after you get elected, like I did, then if you don't pick yourself up and dust yourself off, then you're not going to be able to have anything
You're
at
not going to
all, because
make
you'll
it.
be
Yeah.
too dejected, right? And I was fortunate; I had very supportive friends and a network that, through difficult moments in my 4-year term, said, "No, you've got to stick with it," and I did. Fortunately, having listened to them. But we need more libertarians in government, because as somebody that was the sole libertarian, it can be very lonely, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you need more people there to be able to support you. And you need to be able to recognize that, we're out there and we do exist. We tend not to be inclined to want to hold public office, which makes
No,
total sense, right? Because
totally.
we're opposed to
Because
we're
we're opposed
opposed to
to it.
government.
That's right. Yeah.
So why would you want to be in government? But
When your entire
you
goal
know,
is to avoid government at all costs as much as you possibly can. That's exactly my
libertarians
position.
libertarians shunning holding public office do so at their own peril.
At their own peril, yeah.
Because if you shun holding those positions, you're just going to leave it up to other people, and they will not be libertarians. I can tell you that.
Well,
And that's a missed opportunity. There's the opportunity in local government, in particular, is enormous for libertarians, because it can be quite easy to get elected if you run a pretty polished campaign. In some instances, there are councillors that get elected without any opposition at all. That's the dearth of people going into council and local government.
because there's just not the competition there that there is at the higher levels.
It happens in many rural places in Victoria, I know of, and around the country, is that people who nominate get elected unopposed because nobody else is nominated.
Mm.
So that's how simple it can be sometimes,
But so then you'd affect the people around you at a much more grassroots level, and then hope that transfers upwards.
A friend of mine said to me very early in my term as a councillor, she said to me, "Steve, you actually make a difference just by being in the room, even if you're not having a win on a particular issue. The fact that you're in the room when the decision's being made and you're voicing your concern, that in and of itself has an influence on the policies that are being developed, the way they're being developed, some concessions that you can get from time to time, and also the ability for the general population to see an alternate voice on certain policy issues." There's another old saying that decisions are made by those who show up. And again, if libertarians are checking out of the decision-making space because they don't want to hold public office, then it will be left up to the big government socialists that want to run the show. And because what they want is big government, they love government. Why wouldn't they go into government?
That's exactly right. Yeah, they want
need
control of the.
Yeah, and we need a few more libertarians to take up that challenge, and it's very difficult. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's very difficult being the sole, at times you would say, the sole voice of reason in the room, when people are, I had 4 years where I, for example, opposed rate increases. That's not an easy thing to do when you've got very
the people who benefit from the rate increases.
Yeah, that's right. Very vocal colleagues, and also a bureaucracy that's not very happy with that, because they want to increase revenue, to increase their spending.
That's right.
It can be very tough to face that down sometimes, depending on what the issue is. But you've got to be prepared to do it. And there are libertarians, including many probably watching this podcast or that have been on the podcast, including Jordan, who hopefully gets elected to the Senate in Victoria, who would absolutely support any person who calls themselves a libertarian, who subscribes to that worldview, running for public office and getting there. And if they're having a tough time, then we'll support them.
Amen. Well, you've convinced me, but you haven't sold me. It doesn't sound like something that appeals at all. But
I'm not too familiar with Georgia. Do they have local government in Georgia?
The government here is very, very small. I wrote an article on Liberty Edge about Georgia's history and how a libertarian took over in 2008 and slashed government by over 70%. They sacked the entire police force from top to bottom because it was utterly corrupt. There were people being shot in the streets on a daily basis. There wasn't running water or electricity every day. And this libertarian got in power, gutted the government. Each head of each agency of government had to go to this one guy and present what his agency what their agency did and why they deserved to exist. And he just did the Julius Caesar, and that was it. If he just
Sounds like
decided on the
Javier
spot,
Milei in,
and it's like
Argentina kind of
the whole agency
situation.
closed. Yeah, and so the IMF and all of the usual crowd, the EU, et cetera, were going, you can't do this, it won't work, you'll be bankrupt in a year, blah blah blah. They were in surplus within 1 year. Within 2 years, it was voted one of the top 10 least corrupt countries in all of Europe. It was one of the top 10 safest in all of Europe. They had there was no murders taking place whatsoever. Crime was down 90 odd %. The budget was in surplus. The government was running. Businesses were growing. Became one of the top 10 countries on earth for business freedom. All of these things, and they put in the constitution there are 5 taxes. That's it, and you need a referendum to increase a tax or add a tax anywhere. So
Imagine
very small government.
Imagine if we had that here in Australia.
Oh, it would. I mean, Australia has more potential than any other country on the planet, like you said, with its resources, its farmland, its people, the education, the infrastructure already in place. It is absolutely paradise on earth, and it's just being cocked up royally by the bungling boobs in the government. And I left the country because of them. They just made it insufferable.
I totally agree with you, and the fact that, as we said earlier, that Australia is not the richest country on the planet, with the greatest standard of living.
It's a disgrace. Yeah.
It is a disgrace. And our politicians and government elite are entirely to blame for that situation.
100%.
And I wish more Australians were attuned to it, but, by having conversations like this, hopefully we can do that. I'm going to have to read that article you wrote on Liberty Itch now about Georgia, because it sounds I wasn't aware of that. It sounds fascinating. I didn't think there were too many libertarian governments around the world, but yeah, wow.
No, well, it's he was here for 8 years, and they've had this other party in since the Georgian Dream, which has just been working as hard as it can to just keep the peace, because there's something like 10,000 NGOs from Europe and the US here trying to just cause as much trouble as they possibly can as part of their proxy wars with Russia, because they want to break up Russia and steal the $75 trillion worth of resources that Russia has. So that's what the Ukraine war is about. And there was an election recently going where basically the people voted, as Viktor Orban said, to not become a second Ukraine, because all that the Ukraine war is about the US and the EU throwing bodies at the Russian artillery, because they want Putin to go down. They want to divvy up Russia, and they want to loot it for all of its resources, like they were doing back in the early 90s.
And that's why I'm grateful that Australia is an island far away, but our involvement, in conflicts overseas, we get dragged into a lot. Basically, whatever the United States gets dragged into, Australia's just often there, and you don't have many politicians asking the question, well, why are we involved in that? Is it to the benefit of Australian citizens? Which I think is the platform that Donald Trump got elected on. I think
totally
a lot of American citizens are, quite clearly sick of being involved in wars and sending their, mostly young men off to die in them, for the sake of political arguments and global machinations around the world. They don't want their fingers in that many pies to the disadvantage of US citizens, basically. And I'm not sure that Australia has that same attitude at the moment, or what it would take for us to get there. Both leaders of both major parties seem to be quite interventionist. Ukraine, using that example, is one that they talk about often, and Australia stands with Ukraine and supports Ukraine. And maybe that's the case, but what does that actually mean? And so, one of the things I like to do is ask questions. When a politician says, we stand with Ukraine, we support Ukraine, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that Russia shouldn't have invaded? Okay, well, I agree with you there. Do you mean that Australia should send troops to the front line? What is it that you actually mean in terms of support? Do you think Australian taxpayer dollars should be spent on a war that far away? I mean,
that's right.
These are key questions that the mainstream media in Australia doesn't ask the politicians when they say, we support Ukraine. It's, let's fly the flag, okay, but apart from virtue signalling, what is it that you actually mean? And that's the question I don't think we're getting answered from either of the major parties at the moment in terms of
No,
international affairs.
and the extraordinary part, from my point of view, is I'm a little older than you, but my entire life there hasn't been a single war that wasn't based on lies. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, all of these wars were just absolute manufactured garbage by the mainstream media and the US. And they went in and we assisted with killing 1 million civilians and ousting a bad dude, no doubt. But what happened then? The country's left in an absolute shambles. Everybody, all of the civilians in the country are worse off. They're living, hand to mouth for decades afterwards with
Yes.
soldiers on their territory. You're going, what did you achieve?
And
you didn't achieve anything for Australia. You didn't achieve anything for America. You didn't achieve anything for the country that you ostensibly tried to help. You just murdered a bunch of people at great expense to us, and our debt and our own soldiers were put at risk or died for these wars based on lies. And Ukraine is the latest one. It's just, you see the story twisting and turning and morphing as each lie is exposed as being untrue, exactly the same. And it's funny because the war in Ukraine, it was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, COVID ended. We had COVID lie, invasion, COVID gone, just disappeared overnight. And all of a sudden,
out of
it
the
was
mainstream
Ukraine.
headlines you're talking about.
The mainstream headlines, and all the politicians in the mainstream headlines talked about just disappeared
they had something
overnight.
else to focus on at that point, didn't they?
Yeah, and it did the exact same.
This is the libertarian perspective that is now missing on the centre right of Australian politics, and it goes back to the y-axis on the political compass that we were talking about. It's not there, and I find kind of warmongering talk, and whether it's about and Australia has an interesting history on the Ukraine issue, given the downing of MH17 and the tragic loss of Australian lives on that commercial flight, which was effectively, my understanding is, after the investigation, which was by effectively offshoots of Russian armies that were already operating as rebels on Ukrainian soil, accidentally shot down this commercial flight. And so Australia, for a little period, had a place on the world stage, both as Tony Abbott, this was back when he said he was going to shirt front Putin, and Julie Bishop, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister, who was, on the ground demanding answers. Why were these Australian citizens killed? Why was this plane? Who was responsible for downing this plane? So Australia has a unique kind of history there, but you often don't hear about that anymore. What you hear about in the mainstream media, it's that virtue signaling. It's
yes,
we are going to stand by Ukraine, and it's never any detail about what that looks like. That's the tip of the iceberg. What are you actually saying there? Are you saying billions of Australian dollars needs to be sent to a war zone? Are you saying Australian citizens need to expend their life on the front line? I actually find the warmongering talk amongst the major party, I actually find it repulsive.
I do too.
I think it's disgusting.
Yeah,
and it concerns me that we have amongst the mainstream media, and facilitated by them, very shallow discussions about the Australian government expressing support for or against certain international things and international issues, or saying that we need to, whatever it is, take the fight up to China, or whatever is, goodness me, don't start picking wars with foreign countries that are much bigger and more powerful than we are.
Exactly.
And by the way, and by the way, Russia is a nuclear power and Australia is not. What on earth is Australia going to do? Fighting Russia. That's just, it doesn't.
Well, it's going to die. That's the thing, is that you just go, you don't have a bone in this fight, and at the same time, you can't possibly contribute in any meaningful way. All you can do is send our brothers and sisters to die. And the whole story that you're ostensibly dying for is is questionable and dubious, because it always is. And like I say, my experience from my entire lifetime is you lied the whole way through. The stories never add up and make sense just with the lightest bit of, questioning. But then you get thrown back the same way that you get the racist name calling response. You get the, oh, you're an isolationist. And it's like, I don't even know what that means or why it's a bad
or
thing.
you are a Putin apologist, and you don't.
Well, in this case, a Putin apologist.
You don't support Ukraine as a democracy. I mean, it's just.
But you also go, sorry, just that
insults.
Switzerland has never been considered in a bad light by other countries because it's neutral. It doesn't get involved. It's always been that position. Everyone's been like, Switzerland does it right. They're the good ones. It's like, why don't you want to copy them? That seems to be a policy that works. Just stay out of it. Doesn't mean that you don't support, like you said, moral support. And America, if you want to do that, you go do that. But
at the end of the day, it comes back to questioning power, asking questions of those that are in authority. And the mainstream media in Australia does a very, very mediocre, worse than mediocre job.
Oh, horrific.
At that. And unfortunately, it means on really important issues and subjects that we're barely having discussions that even scratch the surface. It's frightening, and it also means that government, as a result, is then not held to account. And when they're not held to account, they have the perception, bureaucrats and politicians alike, that they're not being watched, and then they push the envelope about what they can get away with. And they know that they can get away with certain things as well.
Yeah, there's no pushback from them. That's exactly right. But all of the pushback comes to, even libertarianism gets criticized, which has always baffled me. It's like, so my view is that I let you do whatever you want to do. As long as you don't hurt anybody else, you do you. You let me do me. If we want to work together, we're all good. Yeah. How can you be against that relationship?
Those horrible libertarians that keep putting freedom and liberty at the forefront of everyone, right. Sometimes at their own expense, because
that's right.
Your rights are somebody else's responsibility. And I think libertarians recognize that more than anyone else, because if your rights are taken away, it's the government's responsibility. It's typically why we have government, to settle disputes between those rights and determine which rights are more important than others. Okay, so your right to do X, Y, Z is actually not as important as somebody else's right to, for example, your right to trespass and walk wherever the hell you want is actually quashed by somebody else's right to own private property and to have peaceful enjoyment of that private property. So we typically have government for those reasons, and that puts a lot of responsibility on all of us to protect our own rights and to not tread on other people's rights. That discussion doesn't happen in Australia anymore. When new policies or when a new piece of legislation is proposed, it is only the libertarians around the country, whether they are Liberal Party members or I don't know if there's any Labor Party members that are libertarian. Maybe they are. Maybe they're libertarian, members of Parliament as part of the Libertarian Party. They're the only ones asking the question about what it actually means for people's rights, and then what is the responsibility then of the government to enforce all of these ridiculous myriad of rules that we're getting that are not actually making our lives any better.
No. So as libertarians, we're at that point. We have to get involved in the political process, or
you've got no choice. If you're not prepared to fight for liberty at this point, then you've got to be prepared to lose it. So that's actually your choice.
Well said.
And so if you're not making a choice to get actively involved, then you are by default making a choice not to, which means you're going to lose liberty.
Sad but true. Steve, thank you very much for your time. That's a lot of food for thought, definitely. So.
There is. I look forward to the future podcasts. I've been listening to this series, and Jordan was a great one to have for your most recent podcast. As I said, hopefully he gets elected to the Senate. We need more libertarians like him to hold public office.
Absolutely,
and he'd make a great contribution to the Parliament in Canberra in reducing the size and power of the government, as Senator Leyonhjelm did before him. So hopefully, if anything, this podcast helps spread the word and can encourage more people to get involved.
I certainly hope so. Yeah, and wish all the best to Jordan too. I agree with you. I think he's a needed voice to help actually make a difference and push us in the right direction.
Absolutely.
And as you say, we just need more of us doing it.
Exactly. Thanks, Damon.
Thanks again.